Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Continuing the Call, a seminary dropout's guide to discernment. Today I'm joined by my friend, Mr. Michael Manternach. Michael is currently pursuing a master's degree at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. Before that, he was a seminarian back in his home state of Iowa for about 2 years. My conversation with Michael revolves around all things discernment. He gives some incredible advice around discerning both the priesthood and preparing for marriage and fatherhood, and really just being open to God's will for our lives. It's one of the best conversations I've had and heard on discernment, so please give it a listen. As always, I ask you to please download and share and really just support this podcast in any way so we can keep having awesome conversations like this one. And as always, most importantly, say a prayer for those men and women who are discerning God's will for their life, and continue to support vocations. Our church needs them, and the men and women who are discerning need our support, no matter where God's calling them. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Mr. Michael Manternach. I hope you enjoy. Well, Michael, thanks so much for being here. Do you want to share a little bit about who you are and kind of where you're at? Just kind of the 30,000 foot view, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. A little about me. I'm from the Midwest, born and raised there, and have a beautiful, supportive family. My parents are devout Catholics, and I was raised in that church, in the church. And an older sister and two younger siblings, a brother and a sister. And growing up with them was incredible because we were just in this, basically this formation in itself, right? The domestic church and the church as a place to learn was really something that I got to experience growing up, which of course at the time I didn't think of it in that way, but it really was a place of just what the family should be, I believe. So growing up in that was such a gift. And I went to Catholic school, discerned into seminary out of high school. So I went into seminary out of high school. And then, so it was a minor seminary associated with college, and was in seminary there, eventually discerned out, finished my degree at that college, and then went on to attempt to get my master's. I say attempt because I'm still in the master's program here now. But that's kind of where I'm at. I'm now on the East Coast for school, and yeah, in my young to mid 20s here, and still figuring things out for sure.
Nice, man. So how's that transition been from Midwest to Northeast? You can't really get any more different than those two places.
It's actually been it's been extremely different, and I would say it's caught me off guard a little bit. I wasn't prepared for the amount of difference. I will say there's great people in both areas, and I feel really blessed regardless. But culturally, it's very different. Even the word pop, I multiple times now I've said, could I have a pop, or you want to toss me a pop? And people stop and actually stare at me for a second, and they're like, "Where are you from?" It's like, "Oh yeah, that's not the lingo." But besides the lingo, it's also just there's a different culture around Catholicism. There's a different culture around being social. There's a different culture in general. So it's been kind of just a very abrupt and immediate kind of change where I've had to pick up on something. Are you familiar with the Midwest wave?
No, I'm not. Is this like the secret handshake of the Midwest?
Sure, you could call it that. Yeah. So there's this joke, I suppose, where when you're driving, you do two fingers up on the steering wheel.
Okay.
And it's very, I mean, I'm sure they do it throughout the country, but in the Midwest, it's very commonplace. And one of the first days here, I was walking, and I was like at a intersection, and I was crossing the crosswalk, and there's a car parked, and they like waited for me. And so I just I waved to them because I was like, "Thank you for waiting," or whatever. And they like stared at me, and it threw me off. And my friend was like, "Yeah, they thought you knew them. They thought they like you. Why would you wave to someone unless they know you?" So little things like that. But yeah. Although it's been a big change, it's been really good to be exposed to a lot of different things, and the people out here have been really, really nice. So feel really, really grateful to have this opportunity, especially with a timeline. I feel like having a timeline like grad school provides, where it's like, okay, when this is done, you know, I know that at least then I'll be able to discern a next step. kind of give some comfort to the scariness that is transitions in life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought it up because it brings up kind of my first question for you. And you mentioned the differences, even down to the Catholicism between the Midwest and the Northeast. The Midwest, like Catholicism, and really particular, I think like in the family, kind of that down to earth, like Catholic family roots, usually bigger families. What's that like? What was it like growing up in that? Like, I mean, you mentioned you grew up Catholic, but I guess kind of what was I imagine going to mass every Sunday. I mean, did y'all pray at home? Give me kind of that scene of that your parents set up of Catholicism in the domestic church.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so this is the example I normally give when people talk about growing up in a family where my parents were devout Catholics. I have a memory, and it was before we moved, so that's kind of the timeline in my head where I know that I was young. I don't know. I was probably like six. I was probably 6 or 5 or something like that. And I remember my mom asking if I wanted to pray the rosary. And I mean, I want sure, right? Whatever. And so 5-year-old me or 6-year-old me or however old, I know it was before I was 7. So young me says yes and doesn't know what he's doing. But my mom just mercifully and lovingly kind of, prays in this way where it's like I'm, just messing with the beads and whatever, but I'm learning in a way, and for sure it's a form of prayer. And I remember thinking like, wow, I am holy. Like we just prayed for like an hour. Like I remember thinking like, wow, I like that was awesome. But I also now reflecting on it know that that was probably 15 minutes. I don't even know if my mom made it through it because I was all over the place. But to grow up in a culture where that was, you know, that was something that was offered, something that wasn't hidden or something to be ashamed of or embarrassed about, but something I was exposed to in a loving, gentle way. And even in obviously an imperfect way. Like as a little kid, thought that that was something that made me, different or something. I don't even know how to explain it, but just being exposed to that was powerful because at the time, in that moment and in that context, I didn't know the significance of it. But now being able to reflect on it, I see the loving exposure that my parents gave me to the things that are beautiful in church. And so I'm so thankful for that. I also think both my parents grew up on what anyone what anyone from a city would call a farm. Um, that there's a different terminology maybe from what a Midwesterner would call a farm, but regardless, growing up in a family that was given the opportunity is now how I'll word it to do outside labor was really beautiful. At the time, I honestly really disliked it, right? But to be able to learn the goodness in work, I believe John Paul II talks about that, where there's like a real humanity in work and what that looks like, um, where we would have to pick up sticks and chop wood and do things that were just, yeah, they respected the reality that work is a part of life, but um, it's not a bad thing, right? And there's authentic work and there's work in community, so my siblings and I were working together when we're doing those things. And then lastly, I'll just say the community I lived in growing up, and one of the blessings of the Midwest that I is really one of the reasons that I'm thinking I'll return there, and if I'm called to marriage, that's where I want to raise a family, is what we would do when we were done, right, with that manual labor. We'd take the bikes and we'd bike down to the lake and we'd fish with the neighbors. I mean, it's like, poetic, right?
Yeah. It's
But
awesome. It's so funny because I'm sure anyone listening is like, "Oh man, that's just like, a little house on the prairie." And like there's almost this like kind of negative like interpretation of it, like, "Oh, that's so quaint." But it's like, "No, that's the dream." Like like it might be quaint, but like that's the dream. And yeah, like the more I hear yourself and like other people tell these stories, it's like, "No, that sounds phenomenal." Like and yeah, and I think you hit on like key points that really now in like studies are coming out about vocations and really about the church and like kind of where the demographics are shifting. And it's like strong two-parent households where both parents are Catholic, larger families or with two or more siblings, and like yeah, like some kind of understanding of like leisure and play and things like that, like are all like key metrics in vocations, and just like kind of longevity in the church. So it's awesome to hear like you say it of like, yeah, that's the secret, that's the formula of like just a good quality life. So I know I cut you off there, but yeah, like
No,
that,
no,
it's
you're
awesome to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I would never have known that or articulated it like that, right? But it's just reflecting back on it. It was like there was this certain amount of humility that at the time, that's not even how I would have put it, right? But my parents didn't really, they were seeking the good life, right? They were not seeking a life that appeared good. And I think there's a huge difference in that. And yeah, I just think about the wisdom of my parents and how blessed I am to grow up in that community. It was incredible. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's that. I think also a difference that I've noticed out here is Catholicism looks, and again, this is a different perspective too. So I just like a disclaimer. Um, I'm here as a young adult, which is like notorious for being kind of a dry spot in in an individual's life as a Catholic member, from what I've heard. And so I don't mean this in a negative way of where I'm at now, um, but growing up in the Midwest, it was something. There was something about the community that is kind of necessary in the Midwest that really I think fostered that Catholic community that so many people long for because there's this natural um, there's both a natural desire to help, but there's also a natural need for it, right? So with weather, with I mean, I believe, and I could be totally mistaken here, but I believe, generally speaking, Iowa's got an older demographic. So within the church, people who are in need of just help and service in regards to like lawn care and things like that, Knights of Columbus and community, things like that. All of those things are not only, I think, provided, um, just as they are in most places in the United States, but there's like a need for it because of the distance between where people live, right? It's more spread out. So there's like a common meeting place and things like that. And that can happen to be the church. And I think in a way, there's like this natural, I wish I could articulate it better, but I think there's a natural ability for the church to be a place of community in the Midwest, as by default, right? Because of how spread out communities are, just based on agricultural geography. There is like this meeting place and this communality, that in the Midwest that I was really, really blessed to experience growing up. And I think it leads to a sort of Catholicism that has to be lived. I think what I've experienced to a certain extent so far out here, and again, this isn't an insult, it's just an experience that I've had at this point, is some sort of cultural Catholicism, which is still beautiful. Um, but there is a difficulty for at times it to be lived out because of the amount of individualistic life that in some ways is beautiful out here for sure. But it's also just part of, I think, city living, right? You don't necessarily want to have a conversation with the person you're passing on the street, because they probably don't want to be stopped because they're busy in your day and you're busy in theirs. Whereas a spread out smaller town has this opportunity and invitation with every interaction where you kind of almost feel an obligation to ask how someone is because you're the only other person in the area.
Yeah, and you know
Right.
you're gonna see them again. Like that same person is going to the same grocery store, the same movie theater. Like you're gonna see them again.
Right.
Um, yeah, I've noticed that too. So all my family's from New York originally, and I still have some family in the city. And anytime I go visit, I realize that the churches are. It's really that mindset of they're great. Like the availability of the sacraments in the city in the metropolitan areas, especially in the Northeast, are incredible, right? Like, we're talking 5, 6, 7 daily masses, confessions all through the week and everything. but in a sense, that's all you're really getting is like you're getting the sacraments, which is fantastic. But the parish understanding of community and programs and things, those seem like really separate from the parish, and they're more of kind of groups or in different organizations. Whereas in the Midwest and in Texas, where I'm at, in this kind of more rural sense, is yeah, the parish is everything. It's not only your sacraments, but it's like you said, it's your community. It's where you go. It's where you have your friends and things. So yeah, I think you're definitely highlighting that, and especially like you said, the young adult period is that weird in between where it's like, hey, so you're out of these formalized programs of high school, and out of college, but you're not yet married and have kids, so it's like you can't be in like mom's groups, or you're not going to be in the parent teacher, circle. So it is that weird dry spot, and then on top of the, being in a city with a million plus people. Um, so yeah, it's rough, but it's good, and it's good to see that you kind of one identifying that, because I think that's the huge part of it is sharing that, because I guarantee you the guy sitting next to you at mass is thinking the same thing of, man, I kind of wish I could say hi, but this guy might have to go to whatever meeting after this. So I definitely want to circle back to the Northeast and kind of where you're at now and how you're going to respond to that. Um, but first, when was the first time you thought about the priesthood? When was that kind of there? Because I want to see kind of that trajectory, because obviously what you're studying now is, in a sense, a fruit of that. But where did this all start? What was the first time? How old were you when you were like, yeah, maybe I could do the priesthood thing?
Yeah, it was at the age of 11. Um, yeah, and when I was 11, I got into altar serving, which there's a lot of I didn't know this at the time, but there's a lot of theological nuances to altar serving and what that purpose is, right? But when I was altar serving, I just remember, you're in the mystery. You're like right there. And yeah, looking at the Eucharistic prayer, or the priest when he's doing the Eucharistic prayer, and thinking, this is meaningful, and I'm like 6 feet away from this. What is that like? How does that impact me? What does that mean? And how, could I do that? Just asking the question of could I do that? And honestly, at the time, it gave me a lot of anxiety to think about that. Um, and I was 11 years old. But I remember talking to my mom and after mass that day, and it was a Sunday morning, and I was like, Mom, like, I thought about this and during mass, and like, what does that mean? I don't know, like, what I want to be when I grow up. And my mom was like, Michael, you're 11. Like, go play outside. Go play outside. And I think that was really good advice. And she knows me, obviously, this in the same way with that intimacy that God knows you, right? Your parents are able to steer you because they know you, especially when you're young. And yeah, just as someone who is an overthinker, anxiety induced person, like I think that was the best advice at the time, right? Just go play and allow God to work, and that question to continue and rest on your heart. Like, could I do that? And I think that's important too, right? Is discernment is a process, and but there's this complexity to it because it's also a choice.
Yeah.
um, but regardless, that was the first time I thought of it, and yeah, as I grew older, I was in a high school relationship, but that was a question that was continually there, and it was something that I thought I have to answer that question. Otherwise, I won't be able to date or discern marriage because I just need that. I need to actually know that. Like it's right in front of me, so I need to ask that question. And yeah, so we can talk about that at another time if you want, or I can go into this
Yeah,
now.
no,
But
yeah, no, go into it, because I think that like you said, I mean, I love the kind of trajectory you point, because it's like the fundamental questions of like, yeah, what do I want to be? Who do I want to be?
mm,
And then I think that key question that you said of like, what if, right? That's like the bane of every discerner's existence, is that question of, man, what if? What if it is that? So yeah, break that down a little bit. So like, yeah, break down the kind of high school drama, the interior drama of like, do I date? Do I go to seminary? What's all going on in your head during that?
mm. Yeah, for sure. So when in high school, it was something that Well, first off, I was very blessed. I had the opportunity to go to Catholic Artwork Camp. And in going to that, for those listening, it's basically a mission trip opportunity. And I went as a high schooler. I was invited to go, and honestly, at the time, I went largely because I was in baseball, which is my favorite sport. But I was in eighth grade, and in the state of Iowa, eighth grade can play varsity. So I was with like 18-year-olds, and it was just like this weird, like anxiety inducing thing where I was like people 5 years older than me were in the same practice, and it was like I don't know. I just was like I don't know if I'm loving this, so I would like to take a break, and this opportunity arose, so I went, and that was actually the opportunity. I think this is probably a different conversation, but within um, the Catholic Church and in most things in life, right? There's this um, you can be inherited something, and that's beautiful. And I was inherited the faith in the baptism as a baby. But there's a certain time in your life when you have to accept that it is your responsibility, and to really to be an adult, to be a woman or a man, and to accept that gift, right? And this was that moment for me when I was 14 years old, but at that camp I was like, this, baseball is my favorite sport. It's mostly everything to me at this time. And I gave up this week because I needed a break, honestly. And I realized during that week that this is what life is about. And I couldn't have articulated it in a very specific way, but I knew that this place where I was going to daily mass doing service and I was uncomfortable was where was the happiest I'd ever been. This place of service, this place of emptying out oneself. And it didn't make sense, but I knew that this is what life was about. Whatever this was, I had found it. Um, and so from there on, I really decided that my high school years were gonna be, I mean, I was gonna do sports, and I had a really good friend group, and we did a lot of the stupid things for better or for worse that high schoolers did. But at the same time, I felt this comfort, and I knew that what life was about at the young age of 14, 15, it was Christ, and that was lived in the church. And there was like this realness to that. So and at times that came into conflict with, as most Christians I'm assuming experience at any level, came into conflict in friendships and other things in high school, right? But at my sophomore year of high school, I entered into a relationship with a girl, and it was really the first relationship that I'd ever been in, right? And so in some ways, I think it'd be appropriate to call it a glorified friendship. I mean, when you don't necessarily know what discernment is in that regard, but you're just kind of aware that that's something people do, and you're both trying to be good Christians. I think it's an experience that's probably necessary, right? Um, and so it was really good to experience that. But there was this tension because even in that relationship, I had that question: what if, what if, what if, what if? And yeah, I remember thinking, you know, multiple things. For one, this isn't really fair to her that I'm asking this question while in this relationship. Um, and two, what does that what does that mean for the future of this? Like, if I have to answer this question at some point, then this relationship has to end at some point. So like, I'll be completely honest. I don't think I was, you know, at 16 years old, I don't think I was acting incredibly wise or prudent or necessarily even respecting her heart in the way that I wish I did. But I also think that's just part of the messiness of being 16 years old.
Yeah, hey, yeah,
Um,
the level of couthness that comes with a 16-year-old trying to navigate life's big questions varies a little
right.
bit. So what's good is I'm sure your culpability is diminished a little bit on that one. So that's
I hope,
good.
yeah, yeah. I hope so. So but yeah, she was incredibly supportive. She's an incredible person, and we're friends to this day. And yeah, I mean, she's striving to be a saint, and she was incredibly understanding and supportive. And so my junior year, I decided I wasn't going to date because I had to answer that question. So I decided my junior year of high school, really, that I was going to apply to seminary in my senior year. Yeah, there was a couple times where I had to actively decide um, to, share with girls that I wasn't. And it's not like they were chasing me by the flag. Let me be very clear.
I don't know. You're a good-looking guy, Michael. I can see it
Well, I
happening.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. But it was,
And
let's
the
just,
irony of it too is like that makes it worse too, because they're like, oh man, he's good looking and loves Jesus. Like that's it. So it's a real thing.
well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. But yeah, just to be clear, definitely not like, this was like crazy occurring thing. But there was a couple times where I had to make the conscious decision to, this is something that I have to answer. And I can't, you know, choose what's exciting in this moment, because this is something that I have to answer. So my senior year, I reached out to the um, vocations director, had a meeting, really not an interview, just a meeting. Went through the normal steps really, and I remember being incredibly uncomfortable in it. Honestly, I was incredibly uncomfortable in it. Um, and I think there's a certain amount of anxiety that comes with any big life decision, right? There's an anxiousness to asking a girl out on a date. There's an anxiousness to, taking a test. There's an anxiousness to anything that will impact your future. So it's not inherently bad to be anxious about those things, but it is difficult. So I went through the process, entered, and yeah, so my first day of college was, I had already been in seminary for a week, but honestly, I'd been in formation and under spiritual direction and things like that for almost like 5 or 6 months. So normally when people ask how long I was in seminary, I say 2 years. I was in school for 3 semesters.
Mhm.
So it's a little gray, right? Because by the time I entered, I had been in the summer formation. I had been doing all those things. So, um, but yeah, so I entered, and that was the first time I recognized a responsibility or a weight on my shoulder that I represent something greater than myself.
Mhm.
I think I probably felt that somewhat in sports growing up, like with my last name and things like that, like, or even academia and other things like, I do represent my family. But there was a heavier weight, I think, to be associated with the church, for its positive things and its negative things, which was a weird cross to have to bear all of a sudden at 18 years old, not really
Yep. Yeah.
expecting that or knowing that. Yeah, so that was a difficulty. The other difficulty that I'm incredibly thankful for was community. There was, I think, about 18 guys. I could be wrong on that, but I'm trying to think. Probably maybe a little under that, in the community. And some of them became my best friends, and other guys really helped me grow and see the short sightedness and the ways that I fall short in myself. Yeah, so there was that. And my first year, or excuse me, my first semester in seminary it was good. It was really challenging, really, really challenging. And I remember coming back for the spring and thinking like, yeah, that was very difficult, but just give it a year and like continue to discern this. And that's when COVID hit. So things went a little haywire. But it was also at this time, and I think this is extremely important to know, or to note, I suppose. It was January, about maybe 2 months before COVID, where one of my seminarian brothers invited me to do a daily holy hour. And so prior to seminary, I'd gone to daily masses occasionally. But once you're in seminary, you're going to daily mass every day. And, there's prayer outside of that as well. So at this point, I was praying the most I had ever prayed in my life. And I was genuinely getting to know the intimate heart of Jesus. And there was an adoration chapel, 24-hour adoration chapel in my home, or not in my hometown, but in the town where my seminary was. Um, and let me just say that I'm a huge advocate for 24-hour adoration. I think there's not enough chapels right now, and I think that's like it's a different conversation, but there's a need. And it wasn't until I started going every day where this surprising desire that really confused me arose to be a husband and father. Um, and so it really startled me. It was confusing to me because it was the first time that I ever felt like I was called.
If you do end up getting married and being a father, like the beauty of that moment of that shift being from, because you mentioned it with your high school dating and your relationships of like, oh, it's just kind of what you do. But now through this experience, which seminary led you to, your approach and mindset to marriage and fatherhood is a vocation, right? In the truest sense of like, hey, you're being called to this, and there's a level of intentionality and desire and dedication and passion that comes with that being sent, that comes through it. So I know you were about to say that in your own terms, but yeah, please go ahead and share that because I love to hear it.
Yeah. And no, yeah, you're totally good, and you're spot on, right? It was this weird thing where it was like, yeah, I long for this. This feels like what I'm made for. Um, and on top of that, there was this assurance that this desire that I was not aware of, and this call, if I can be so bold to call it a call, and I'll get into that maybe later, but was that it was in the moment of my greatest intimacy with God, the time that I was praying the most and really like in a place where I felt like I knew my true self, that I was able to experience this, right? I chose Villanova. Currently, I'm going to grad school at Villanova, and I chose it because it's an Augustinian school. And right, Augustine talks about that. He talks about how the longing for our heart, is God ultimately, but also God knows our heart better than we know it. I really hope I'm not putting words into Augustine's mouth, but I believe that's what he said. So, um, this idea that the closer I grow to God, the better I will understand myself and who I'm made to be, is something that's really reassuring, I think. And so, yeah, so I experienced that. Um, and then COVID hit, and I was, FaceTiming my spiritual director, and he was calling for slow discernment, because there's, again, discernment is a choice, but prudence is also important. And after experiencing that desire, I was like, I want it. Like I want that. Like so do I leave? And he's a very wise man, and he is, telling me to it's good to know that, but to take it slow. So I stayed in seminary throughout the rest of that spring and throughout that summer, and then or not entered, but returned in the fall. Um, and I'll be completely honest, the fall semester was I mean, it was a not good semester. I was longing for to take a step, right? I felt like I knew the next step and I wasn't able to take it, in an attempt to be prudent, which was making me rather miserable. And in being miserable, Ignatius of Loyola, is it? Who is it? Who says, yeah, Ignatian spirituality, don't take a spiritual step if you're not in a great
Yep.
place. But I wasn't in a great place because I wasn't taking a spiritual step. So it was a circle. And yeah, so I was white knuckling it for sure. And if I could have if I could go back, I think I would approach that same struggle differently. But nonetheless, that's what I experienced and I learned in that. And so, at least in the seminary I was at in the diocese that I call home, we do once a semester we meet with the vocation director in seminary. And so in December, it was like finals week. I met with the vocation director, and he asked, "How are you?" And yeah, so this was the end of my third semester in seminary. I shared with him how I was, and he stopped me and he said, "You've used the word fear 9 times, and we've been together for 5 minutes." Uh, and he said, "That's not a spirit of that's not of the Holy Spirit." And he said, "I think you're not leaving out of fear, perhaps. And I want you to, after this meeting, I want you to, you know, take the week, take 2 weeks, whatever. It'll be Christmas break. But call me and let me know if you're planning on returning to seminary in the spring." And in some ways, I felt like that was the permission that I needed.
Yeah.
To acknowledge that this wasn't where I was supposed to be at that time. And something else he said to me that I don't think I'll ever forget, is that there's a lot of good things worth doing that are scary. Most good things in life that are worth doing are scary. And he was saying that in really a way to tell me that I should leave, right? Not in like a disciplinary like way, but just in a way like this is where your discernment's led you, like have the freedom to go.
Yeah.
And I'm incredibly thankful for that. Because I do think I needed some sort of like acceptance or like assurance that that was okay.
hmm Yeah, yeah. Talk on that real quick, just about that, because I think that that's something that, unfortunately, like a lot of guys, a lot of men and women feel when they're in formation of like, oh no, what do I do? Like, on one hand, you can't deny the fact that, God's calling you out, but on the other side, like, you don't want to let people down, and then it's like, okay, well, am I really called to something? Because, the priesthood and religious life, it's so good, surely that's where I'm supposed to be and that's where I'm of most use. Um, Talk a little bit about that, kind of what was going through your head of weighing those two things out.
Yeah, I think there's a complexity to choosing two goods. And obviously I'm not the first to say that vocation between not between, but a vocation of marriage or a vocation of priesthood is they're two goods that one discerns when they're looking at which one to they're called to. Um, and so you're right. Like there should be, I think there ought to be a desire and a recognition that what does the world need? What is good? So then the third question is like, do I go there? Right. And within the priesthood, there is the first two are there. Um, is it good? Yes, it's good. Is it beautiful and needed? Yeah, it is. There's a need for priests. And so, there's a certain duty is a real thing. As a Catholic man, duty is a real thing. But you've also been made to be who you are. And your duty is to be who you are and who you've been called to be. Like ultimately, you're at who you're actually called to be, not, some mediocre like settling, but like who you're actually called to be in your fullness. And so there is a humility, I think. Honestly, at least that's how I would describe my own experience, a humility to recognize that something may be great, but may not be for you.
Mm.
It may be beautiful. In some way, you may even want it. Because I think that's something also that I've recognized. Like there is a want there. Like yeah, of course, like
Yeah.
you'd be crazy to not want to be a priest,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and just
but
on the converse of that too, like, yeah, I think that you talk to any priest, you talk to any religious sister, they'll say the same thing. Like, everyone, every, good Catholic man or Catholic woman has a desire for a family, has a desire to be a spouse. So yeah, it is that. But like you said, it's like just because it's good and beautiful and true doesn't mean that that's for you. And we're not just kind of a utilitarian society, and more importantly, utilitarian church, where it's like, oh, we need more priests. So like, it's not a draft system. It's not you. It's yeah, it's who you are. It's, is this individual called to that? So yeah.
yeah, and I would say that I think the crux of my discernment, honestly, and something that I would still consider a discernment or I mean, just a question that everyone I think needs to face at some point in their life maybe that's a bold statement, but I really do think it's the truth, is the fundamental and first question of who am I? Because I think there's also a temptation, like you said, you had mentioned how within discernment and leaving, there's also this fear of disappointment, right? Which is fair. And it's something I experience. I think it's something most people experience, even if in general their family isn't supportive. Like there's plenty of people in seminary who are courageous people who are in seminary despite a lack of support. But that still doesn't mean that they don't have a fear for other reasons of leaving, especially maybe they're scared that people will take their leaving out of context and assume that, they left for, some negative reason or something like that. But I think if you answer the fundamental question of who am I, and the answer, of course, is beloved, and to know that and to live that is two different things itself. But regardless, that is the first step in discernment, in recognizing that if you know that, then you have this ability to be who you truly are called to be. Right? If you recognize that you're beloved, then the idea of choosing a vocation, or choosing a decision because of this attempt to earn something or earn the Father's love doesn't exist, because it's already been given, right? So I think there's this fundamental need to recognize, who am I, beloved, and who is God, a good Father. I think there's two things there that are fundamental, and something that I wrestle with to this day. I think everyone wrestles with it, right? But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I love it. And yeah, everything you're saying is like, it's that weird situation where it's like, man, everyone should hear this. And it's like this weird conundrum of like, you want to go shout at, guys who are in the seminary and say like, hey, some of you shouldn't be here. But then you also want to go shout at all these guys who are dating like, hey, break up with them, go to seminary, right? Like, because like at the end of the day, like that's what it is. Like if you're not asking that question of like you said, of who am I, and who's God, and where am I called, not only are you missing out, not only taking the utilitarian view of like, not only is the church missing out and your community missing out, right? Like if you're called to be a priest and you're not being a priest, people are suffering because of that, and vice versa. If you're just kind of sitting there and twiddling your thumbs and not going out and having beautiful Catholic families, people are missing out. But more than that, you're missing out, right? Like your individual self, like you are missing out to the call to sanctity and to holiness and to adventure, that comes with a vocation. And I think that that's part of it too, is like, I think so often in discernment, we're afraid to make decisions because it's like, oh, well, what if? But it's also like, hey, no, wherever this goes, when you say yes, it's going to be far better for you, wherever it ends up, because it's who you're supposed to be. And like the doors that will open through that are much better. So yeah, like you said, just having that confidence that, the God who made us is the God who loves us and calls us to adventure. And that's the God who gives us our vocation, right? So like, it's not like he's going to call you to something that's not going to make you happy. And I think we forget that because it's kind of, this paralysis. So yeah, so take me through. So you leave seminary, you decide it's not for you. You know, in a sense, the dating world is almost harder than the seminary world, because it's you can stand there and say like, hey, I want to be a priest, and the path's kind of laid out. Not really so in dating, and not to air all of the your dating situation, but take me through that. What's it like? Now kind of equipped with this desire and this vocation, to hopefully be a husband, be a father. Where do you start? There's no seminary for that.
Yeah.
How's that going for you?
I would I would say that it's going well, and I would say from an outside secular perspective, everyone would say I doubt that. Um, but
That's good. That means you're probably in the right position. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. If you're doing right by the church, and wrong by society, you're probably doing the right thing.
probably, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I think there's a couple things. So you're absolutely right. There's not a tarmac, right, to like take off in the same way that like if you're discerning priesthood, like you need to like the step is, call the vocation director or like do a come and see visit. or like do something like that, right? Um, and so I think there's two things that are the metaphorical tarmac that you take off um, on when you're trying to discern marriage. And these are two, I would say, unformulated or unfinished thoughts that I'm praying with to this day. So forgive me. But first off, um, surround yourself with the sacraments. Um, the reason that I think I was called to seminary is because I couldn't have been the man I'm called to be in marriage unless I had been the person who was formed in seminary. And that formation happened around the sacraments. And so when I left seminary, my biggest fear was lessening in my relationship with God, growing away from Him. And so the goal that I struggle with to this day, but still attempt to do, is a daily holy hour and daily mass. If that's provided in seminary with tons of obligations, then that's something I should be able to fulfill as a single person currently. And maybe that's a bold statement. It's definitely challenging. I definitely fall short. But it's a standard I want to hold myself to because at the very least, that's a standard that I can, if when I don't hit the mark, maybe I'll get, to a holy hour, or maybe I'll get to daily mass, or maybe I'll get, intentional prayer time throughout that day if I don't make the mark, right? The worst that can happen is I still get prayer in if I fall short. So I think maintaining the relationship with God in an intimate way is necessary. And I think doing so allows for a reminder that God is a good father, that he's walking with you, that he hasn't left you, or that he's not scheming, but that he's walking with you, and you're leaving the seminary was a step where he walked with you, and relationship X, Y, or Z, first date X, Y, or Z, isn't something where he leaves, but is where he's walking with you. And so I think there's that. And then the other thing is, this, and I kind of mentioned it earlier. I don't even know if we were on yet, recording yet, but there's this complex thing with discernment where it takes time and there's prudence. You also have to act. And I think, at least for me personally, and I think this is probably a pretty common area where people will fall short, is that discernment in marriage. When you discern marriage, you discern with someone, right? So, like right now, as a single person, I'm preparing for discernment in marriage, right? I'm trying to grow as an individual. But feeling called to marriage, I actually have to ask someone on a date, right? And I won't know if they're going to be my wife. That's why I need to go on a date. Right? And so there's this amount of uncertainty that we're invited into, which is unsettling. But I think it's also beautiful because when done appropriately, you can build friendships, you learn more about yourself. And it's also just a really good ability and skill to learn in words of just like being able to socialize with another person, respect them, and see them as, another person who they truly are, and as a beloved daughter of God. I think it's a good practice in and of itself. But I think a lot of times I would say, and again, this is really just from my own perspective and what I see and what I've experienced, but the hesitancy to go on a date because, well, I don't know if, I'm going to want to date them. That's why you go on that date, right? There's that hesitancy there, which is difficult. But I think those two things are the tarmac to discerning marriage, would be to actively choose to ask people on dates, and also to surround yourself with the sacraments. And so that's kind of where I find myself now currently. I think there's also, I will say, sometimes, and this is for me, I would assume this is a common, and maybe you can speak to this if you're comfortable sharing it as well, but I think there's a temptation. So a lot of times in discernment and in culture within Catholicism, there's, don't close the door. Don't close the door,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's wisdom to that. So when I left seminary, I was like, I won't close the door. But something that I've had to think about, the 3 years since I've been out of seminary too, is in not closing the door, in looking in the rear view so often and questioning whether I need to return. Am I ever looking in front of me to the girl who's, you know, I'm supposed to ask on a date, or right? And maybe that metaphor is stretched a little bit, but
Mhm.
my
Yeah.
my my point. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah,
Go for
no, no, no. I think you're right on with it, and you know, thankfully in my weakness and frailty and ignorance, I almost missed that. I almost did the exact thing you're warning against. So when I left the seminary, I left fully with the intention of going back. So I left my formation with the diocese, fully with the intention of joining a religious order. Like I was convinced that that's where I was called. I had discerned that, but in order to switch from diocesan formation to religious formation, you have to usually take a bit of a gap year just to kind of transition out and all of that. Um, and in that meantime is when I reconnected with my lovely wife. Just originally, it was I was going back to the parish to volunteer because I now have this theology degree, and I was like, well, I should probably at least do something with it. So I went back to the parish, and lo and behold, the girl that I always thought was very pretty in high school and would always talk to and always kind of say, hey, we should date, we should get married. And of course, she was a few years older and wanted nothing to do with me because I was a dumb high school kid before I went to seminary. But I went back and she was running the program. She was running the youth ministry program, so I ended up being one of her volunteers. Um, and through that, we kind of our relationship started to blossom, and very quickly, I think her and I both realized like, oh, hey, this is probably what we're called to. I think certainly for her, she was like, hey, this is a guy I could see myself marrying. And but for me, it was like the first time that I had been presented with this reality of like a concrete option of, hey, this could be your spouse. And I ran from it. Because I was like, well, that's not my plan. That's not what I was supposed to do. I left seminary. I'm supposed to go join the religious order. So I told her multiple times, like, hey, this is great. This was like while we were dating, like, hey, this is great. This is awesome, but I'm gonna go be a priest. And luckily, the saint that she is, accept that lovingly and graciously. It didn't fight and said, okay, well, if that's not where you're called to be, I'm here. And not in the sense of like, she was defaulting and saying that. Like, there was clearly a timeline, right? If I had gone and 20 years later picked up the phone and tried to call her, she would have said no. Um, but really, in that space of just her docility to it, um, gave me the space and also kind of the kick that I needed to be like, to go to prayer and have God really yell at me and tell me like, hey, um, I don't care about your plans, right? Like, I know what's gonna make you happy. And it's her. And in my case, it was my wife. And obviously now I look back and I'm like, that I'm so grateful for her for leading me to that, and so grateful for God for reminding me of that, of like, hey, you trusted me to enter seminary, you trusted me to leave seminary, you trusted me to go on a couple dates with this girl. Now trust me in my call for you to marry her. And the moments that I spent looking in the rearview mirror, I was missing where I was supposed to be. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, yeah, what a beautiful story, right? That's awesome. Thanks for
Yeah, one
sharing
day,
that.
no, of course, one day I'll get Amanda on here and she'll share her side of it, which is certainly better because she can kind of hold my feet to the fire a little bit more and say like, no, I was being an idiot. But yeah, I think you're right with that of like, um, I always say that of like, you know, everyone always asks, oh, what changed, what changed, what changed in formation, or like, oh, you were going to be a priest and now you're not, and it's like, in a sense, yes, there is a change, right? It was priesthood, now it's married life and what you're discerning. But at the core of it, hopefully nothing changes, right? You went into seminary, desiring to be a saint, desiring communion with God. You leave seminary, desiring to be a saint, desiring communion with God. The only thing that's changed is the direction that you're taking to do that, but the end goal has not changed. And I think that's the goal, and what we need to remind people of is like, because your route changes doesn't mean your destination has changed.
Right. Fundamentally, your end goal should stay the same. Yeah. And I think the other thing, like just when your words, not mine, when you're calling yourself an idiot, I think there's a grace and like a peace in understanding that. the the idiots that we are also the same person that God already knew we would be when He created our plan, right? And that's one of the reasons that I just love Peter, Saint Peter,
Hmm.
because I feel like, is the epitome of getting confused, lost, going all in, but still finding his way back. Um, and there's peace to that. At least for me, there's peace for that, especially in, as you said, someone who's not at a end, that's like, you know, in the vocation. And then again, vocation in itself isn't really an end, but so to speak. But yeah, that's kind of my I would say discernment story at the time. Like at this time now, I'm currently trying to prepare myself to be a man who can discern marriage and going on first dates and things like that in the Philadelphia area, and seeing what God has in store.
That's awesome. Real quick, on that, what are you doing? I guess like how are you preparing? What kind of husband do you want to be?
I want to be the husband and a man who gets his wife and his children to heaven.
Amen.
Um, yeah,
Amen.
to
That's the
put it
right.
in
That's no,
sentence.
that's the right answer right there. That's awesome. And no, I think that that's it. And it's interesting. I obviously have a ton of these conversations, and I listen to talks on vocation and discernment ad nauseum. But I got to say that the stuff you've shared here, it's not only unique. Obviously, it's the same kind of wisdom, but the way you phrase it, I think, is so clear and so concise, and you clearly have a heart and a mind for discernment, and it's awesome to hear. And again, I think the irony of all of these stories that when I talk to people who were discerning and all that is, um, while you and I may not be called. Odds are people who hear our words will be.
Hmm.
And the greatest grace that I think we'll get is when we get to heaven, God willing, we'll meet people who said, "Hey, I heard you say this one time," or "I met somebody who was following your advice, and that led me here." And I can honestly say, listening to your talks, I know that's going to be the case. Whether that's obviously from this very small audience that we have here, but more importantly, in all of your other ministries, yeah, you're leading people to heaven, man, and it's awesome to hear, and it's so clear. So keep it up, because yeah, one day, whether it is, Mr. and Mrs. Manternach, or Father Michael, who knows, whatever it may be, you're on the right path, man, and it's awesome to hear.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I just have to applaud the work you're doing. And I think it's wonderful because I mean the more resources we can create, right? And just support individuals who I think oftentimes feel like they're on an island, even though they're definitely not. Is yeah, it's gonna do good for the church and for the world. So again, just have to applaud you for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Hey, we're all in this together, and it's awesome to see. Last little bit, give me like a couple sentences on give some people some hope that we have a lot of people, a lot of students who are out there discerning and going through that rough period of discernment, whether it's for dating or marriage. What's your message of hope to the people discerning?
Mhm. For one, it would just be a call to remember that God is a good father. And in being a good and loving father, he has your intention, your best in mind. And to rest in that should be, if we're able to truly trust in that, something that only gives us peace. The other piece of advice, of hope that I would say going forward is to remember that discernment's complex, it's messy, it's very stressful sometimes, but you are not your story. You have your story, and it's beautiful and it's a gift. Um, but you've already been claimed um, by God. You're beloved, and regardless of the success, the failures as you perceive them, you are in God's plan. You're in His hands, and He's working through you. So refute the lie that you are your failures, or that you are defined by your failings, and accept the reality that you are defined by His love only, and in that you know it only goes up.
Yeah,
In
no,
that
absolutely.
you'll find him. So yeah.
I love it, man. I love it. You're wise beyond your years for sure. And yeah, God bless your parents for giving you that foundation. We obviously can't overstate that. The gift of our parents, or those people who build those foundations. But you're certainly not letting it go to waste. So I love it, man. Thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.